here's a funky introduction about Cuomo. Tell your mama, tell your auntie, he a no, bro. How you talk big and bad like you about ish. Raid the MTA, protect your homies' pockets.
Wait, is that Zohran Mamdani? Assembly member.
How's it going?
So does this mean that Mr. Cardamom is making an appearance?
No, he's in memoriam. He's definitely in retirement, not coming back.
Okay, fair enough. So you know there's another great New York City rapper by the name of Cardi B, and she once said, too much done doubted me, that's why I had to just prove it. And I see parallels here with you. When you first launched your candidacy, folks were like, there's no way a 33-year-old socialist can win mayor, but now you're maxed out donations, you know, you're polling second behind Andrew. Are you surprised at all about all this momentum, and what do you think it is about your campaign that's speaking to people the way that it is?
You know, from the very beginning, we were confident that New Yorkers were hungry for a different kind of politics, a politics that put working people first, and one that required no translation. And we launched this campaign 6 months ago, and yes, I would say from the beginning it has been surprising just how we felt that hunger and what the extent of it has meant. Mm-hmm. You know, on the first day we launched, we wanted to raise $50,000 in that first 24 hours. We raised more than $130,000, and that's been the story at so many different junctures, because it's not just that we're the fastest campaign in history to maximize the public matching system, it's also that we've knocked on now more than 200,000 doors because we have a volunteer team of 15,000 people. And when we look at this race, it is really a referendum on the failed leadership we have in New York City. And we know that our present failed mayor is not going to be the next mayor of the city. But we really have a choice between the failures of a disgraced former governor of the past versus the promise of a future. And that's what our campaign represents.
So we have to talk about the S word. Running as a proud socialist, yes. You're not running away from that label. Some people hear that word and it's kind of scary. They recoil, right? So in your words, what does it mean? Boil it down to its essence.
I would say as a Muslim as well, I'm no stranger to bad PR and people recoiling from a term. You know, I'm a democratic socialist. That is language that I was given through the Bernie 2016 campaign when I finally understood how to describe my politics. And what it's meant for me is that everyone has what they need to live a dignified life. That democracy can't just exist at the ballot box, it has to exist in the rest of our lives. And I think that people understand that at an instinctual level. People understand that when you have a conversation with them, the real difficulty is whether you can actually open that door to have that. And that's why the volunteer team, that's why the fundraising, that's why all of it is so critical, because it allows us to explain what this campaign is actually fighting for, which is working people being able to afford the city that they built.
What a radical idea, right? So let's talk about public safety. It feels like there's been a bit of a sprint away from the calls that we saw in 2020 to divest from policing and invest in communities and in alternative systems of public safety. But the conditions that led people to call for divesting from policing still persist, right? The targeting of Black and brown communities, stop and frisk is continuing to balloon. And your public safety plan kind of stands out to me in that it embraces many of those calls that we saw in 2020. Talk to me about your plan for this new agency and what your vision is for public safety in New York.
I think ultimately our vision is one that recognizes that every New Yorker deserves to be safe, and that when Eric Adams ran in 2021 and he promised New Yorkers they need not choose between safety and justice, he's shown himself fundamentally uninterested in the latter and unable to deliver the former. And so what we're putting forward is an approach that is built around the necessity of having outcomes. Ultimately, what New Yorkers care about is being safe, not the debate around how to deliver it. And so we're actually going to aggressively pursue the policies that have accomplished that elsewhere in the country, and that understand that while police have a critical role to play in public safety, the reliance of them to deal with every single failure of the social safety net is preventing them from doing their actual jobs, is a large part of why we have such low clearance rates across major categories of crime, and is not the most effective way of dealing with these many different examples of why New Yorkers are not feeling safe in this moment.
What are you thinking about the size of the NYPD in terms of budget, head count?
You know, I think a lot of times there's a focus on budget and head count where there really should be a focus on public safety. What I've said from the beginning of the campaign is that that is the goal. And there are a number of things when it comes to the NYPD that do not bring us closer to that goal. Whether it's a strategic response group, a unit that has been found guilty of brutalizing many New Yorkers over many years when they're exercising their civil rights in protest, or it's the fact that we have an ever-growing, more than $1 billion overtime budget. I've committed to eliminating that. Or the fact that the NYPD until very recently had more than 80 people staffing a communications department and still was not able to transmit the basic facts of a case. And I've appreciated that Commissioner Tisch has, engaged with our call to downsize that department to the bare minimum. The commissioner has it at about 40 people. I still think that that is too large for the basic requirements of that position. And ultimately, it all comes back to what actually creates safety. And if it doesn't, then why do we have it?
On the communications department piece is so funny when they put out that like propaganda video. It's like, do we really need y'all doing that? But to switch gears a little bit, housing is another big issue this year. I'm born and raised in the city. I know you're raised here as well, and I'm pretty sure you can relate to seeing year after year people you know being priced out of their neighborhoods, pushed to the peripheries of the city, while we're also seeing these luxury developments pop up that are not accessible to, you know, people who need stable housing the most. Everyone pretty much agrees that we need to preserve our existing affordable housing stock and also create more. But what is your specific approach to doing that?
You know, first I want to give a shout out to Anish, who's a friend of mine who designed our logo. He is someone who used to live in Astoria and now has to live in Philly. And it's just a story of so many people who have been New Yorkers who are now being pushed out of the city that they love, the city that their work is still a testament to. And you know, to your question around the housing crisis, what makes our campaign distinct is that we believe the public sector has a role to play. The scale of this crisis is immense. I mean, last year there was a 7-day period where we opened up a waiting list for New Yorkers to apply to get assistance in paying their rent for Section 8. In just those 7 days, more than 600,000 New Yorkers applied. And about 250,000 or so won. And I put it in quotation marks because all they won was a place on a waiting list for a program that admits about 250 people a month. That is completely unacceptable and is completely out of step with the scale of the crisis. So we've said, yes, alongside the zoning changes to allow the private market to play a critical role in building the housing that we need, whether it be upzoning wealthier neighborhoods that haven't historically contributed to affordable housing production, or increasing density around mass transit, or ending requirements to build parking lots when you build housing. Alongside all of that, there has to be a muscular role for the public sector to deliver housing that's immediately affordable. Because I represent Steinway in Astoria, and I'll call a constituent and I'll say, hey, there's an affordable housing unit that's come up online, would you like to apply? And they'll say, how much do I need to make a year to apply for this? And I'll say $140,000, and they'll hang up the phone. Because how is that affordable? And what we need to do is build it to the realities of New Yorkers. So this 200,000 figure that we've said we're going to build over the next 10 years of permanently affordable, union-built, rent-stabilized homes, that is a commitment, and those are homes for families of four that make $72,000 a year, the median household income. It's finally to create affordability for the very New Yorkers who can't find it today in the market.
So you're not a NIMBY, you're not a YIMBY, maybe a RISIMBY, rent stabilized in my backyard. I don't know if that has a ring to it or not.
I'm someone who thinks we need to build more housing across our city, and someone who thinks that a lot of that housing needs to be immediately affordable.
And staying on the cost of living crisis of it all, one of your most interesting proposals, I think at least, is your plan to create city-owned grocery stores. Obviously, with inflation, we've seen the price of groceries go up pretty significantly. Me as a single person, admittedly, who's also a tourist and loves food, but also, you know, I love a good coupon, you know? So my grocery bill is insanely high, but then I think about, you know, New Yorkers who have families to feed and how their grocery bills stretch their budgets so thin. So how would that work, the city-owned grocery stores?
So this is building off of successes that we've seen elsewhere in the country, namely in Kansas, where there's been a municipal-owned grocery store for a number of years that for some of those years has actually turned a profit. And a feasibility study that was conducted in Chicago about the implementation of that model in an urban setting, which found it to be not only doable, but urgently necessary. And it speaks to two twin crises that are happening in New York City. One, affordability, and two, food deserts. So with affordability, whether you speak to a New Yorker who's making $40K a year or $200K a year, you will hear this sticker shock that people speak about when they go to the grocery store and the same item they could afford 4 years ago is now out of reach. Most especially right now when it comes to eggs. And then the second crisis is that of food deserts. I represent Queensbridge Houses, the largest public housing development in North America. And when I speak to my constituents, I have to answer questions for which there is no answer, which is why in a 5-block radius are there 6 fast food restaurants, but only one place I can buy produce, and that produce is either out of date or unaffordable? Why is there nowhere for me to actually get the food that would keep me healthy? And what this model would do of a network of municipal owned grocery stores is it would start with one grocery store in each borough that is guaranteeing cheaper prices to New Yorkers. And it's doing so by having its ultimate mission be exactly that, and by taking the savings that also come with a large-scale logistical approach of an actual network and coordination, whether it be through purchasing or through storage, that can deliver those savings on to customers instead of what happens oftentimes with these corporate supermarkets, where wherever there are savings, they actually just absorb them into the profits of the model.
Free buses is another part of your plan. Talk to me about that.
So I am very passionate about our bus system here in New York City. More than 1 million New Yorkers ride the bus every single day. And we have the slowest buses in the country. And these are buses that could in fact be a model for this nation. And they could be that by making them fast and making them free. So I've been an assembly member. I'm in my 3rd term now. And one of the things I'm most proud of is having launched a campaign called Fix the MTA, where we launched a campaign that won more than $100 million in state budget negotiations, within which was not just a reduction of the fare hike, not just $35 million for increased subway service, but also a first of its kind free bus pilot. We won $15 million to make 5 bus routes free. And when we made each of those bus routes free, one in each borough, we saw that ridership went up by up to 38%. Assaults on bus drivers went down by 38.9%. And the most significant increase of riders were those New Yorkers making $28,000 a year or less. So it had these incredible benefits from public safety to economic relief and accessibility. It also had environmental effects where 11% of new riders stopped taking a taxi or a car they were driving and got onto the bus. So it shows that public transit is one of the most effective tools at delivering us the world that we want, the world that we deserve. And I believe that every New Yorker should benefit from that kind of an approach, not just the ones who live around those 5 routes. So it's been one of the cornerstones of the campaign that we would make every single bus in New York City not only fast, but also free.
So you know the question that's probably popping up in people's minds right now, the money, honey, right? These things,
I'm ready.
The things are going to cost. So what is your plan for funding these proposals?
So I'm very glad you asked, because we put out an explicit proposal about, I think it was last week, although time is now a blur. And in that proposal, we showcased how we're going to raise $10 billion a year. And we're going to do that in a few ways. The first is by raising the top corporate tax rate in New York State to match that of the radical socialist utopia of New Jersey. We're going to go from our level of 7.25% to their level of 11.5%. That in and of itself raises about $5 billion. Then we're going to raise income taxes on the wealthiest 1% of New Yorkers who make more than $1 million every year, by a flat increase of 2%. That raises $4 billion. So together we're talking about 9. And then we raise the final $1 billion through good governance, procurement reform that would save us $300 million a year by reducing procurement costs just by 1%, by hiring the fiscal auditors that we need to actually collect on our existing business tax. That would raise $165 million just from having more people to actually do the work that they're supposed to. And finally, by collecting the money that New York City is owed. We're currently owed more than $2 billion in fines and fees, including $800 million from landlords that the city has shown itself completely uninterested in actually collecting.
You touched on Trump-proofing our city, and to close out this portion of our conversation, and I hate to end it on such a heavy note, but this is the reality of where we are, right? With this new administration, we've seen this ramping up of this disappearing of people that the administration sort of arbitrarily deems as a threat. What would you do to safeguard or to strengthen safeguards and protections for New Yorkers from ICE?
I think the first thing to do is to actually live up to the laws that we have here in New York City, which are sanctuary city policies. These are policies that have been defended by Republicans and Democrats alike for decades, and yet Eric Adams has fear-mongered about them for such an extensive period of time that we've come to think of them as the illustration of all that's wrong with the city, when in fact it is an evidence-based approach that has made us safer across New York City. It's actually reduced crime. What I would do is not only stand up for those policies, but would strengthen them. I would establish an oversight commission that would ensure we have 100% compliance with the law, which is that New York City schools, hospitals, properties, as well as properties of city contractors are not to allow ICE agents within their facilities unless those agents show a judicial warrant that's been signed by a judge. And in addition, I would actually speak up for the New Yorkers that are being disappeared off of our streets, because what we're seeing right now is Eric Adams offering collaboration, whether it be in having ICE agents on Rikers Island or in general consent that's being provided for this mass deportation mission, or cowardice, like that shown by Andrew Cuomo when it took him more than 72 hours to speak up on Mahmoud Khalil's disappearance, and that in a statement where you didn't even know if he actually wanted him released, which he then walked back 24 hours later. And what we're seeing right now is the need for leadership that speaks clearly that every New Yorker deserves the protection not only of the law, but also of a leader. And that's what I will do true, because it's tempting to think that this repression is only coming from DC, but it's being echoed by institutions across New York City, whether we're talking about NYU Langone or Columbia University, who received many an email from the very students that are currently in ICE detention, asking for help, asking for guidance, emails which they did not get responses to.
Well, let's lighten things up for a second. So we're going to do a little lightning round. First question.
Hit me.
I know our current mayor loves a zero bond moment. Something tells me that's not necessarily your vibe.
Municipal bonds. That's my bond.
But where is your favorite place in the city to unwind, to let loose, have a little fun?
Favorite place in the city to unwind? I have to get a favorite place because I can't be picking winners and losers out
Fair
here.
enough.
Okay, one of my favorite places is Kebab King in Jackson Heights.
Okay.
Can't knock it, no matter what time it is.
I respect
Best place
it.
to be.
Second question. What is a piece of old New York that you're sort of nostalgic for or that you miss?
Absolute Bagels.
I don't even know Absolute Bagels.
Oh my
What's the tea on that?
goodness. Okay, so I moved to New York City when I was 7 years old. I grew up in Morningside Heights. Absolute Bagels, to me, was the best bagel shop in New York City.
Okay.
And that's where I'd go after middle school for my poppy seed bagel, scallion cream cheese, some pulp Tropicana, sit right there. And now it's gone.
All right, and last question.
Hit it.
You know you're a real New Yorker when?
You miss the bus, but you run and you catch up to it and still get it at the next stop.
I'm always too embarrassed to run the bus, but
I have run so many times, especially the BX10.
yeah.
When I was in high school, I'd get off the one train at 231st. I would just see the bus right there, and then it would be like, you gotta just, and then you're slapping the back of the bus. You're like, play!
Well, on that note, Assembly Member Zohran Mamdani, thank you so much for
Thank you.
this.
This was such a pleasure.